Hello, I'm Floyd Stokes, your Age 8-2 Introduction to Law Enforcement instructor at College of the Redwoods. Today I'm going to discuss Chapter 7, Core Police Functions. This chapter has 4 learning objectives. 1. Describe the types of patrol, methods of patrol, the response role, and the traffic function. 2. Describe the functions of peacekeeping and order maintenance. 3. Identify investigative goals and explain the investigative process. And 4. List and describe some significant issues associated with undercover work. First of all, the police mission in this country is essentially 5-fold. 1. To enforce and support the law. 2. To investigate crimes and apprehend offenders. 3. To prevent crime. 4. To help ensure domestic peace and tranquility. And 5. To provide local communities, states, and the nation as a whole with needed enforcement-related services. The text describes each of these missions in detail on page 102. Most of us are familiar with policing because of the patrol function, although movies and television tend to focus more heavily on the investigative function. The patrol. This component of police organizations is generally associated with state and local law enforcement, and it represents the largest organizational unit within these departments. The patrol division is an extremely high visibility component of the police department, and most sworn officers are assigned to patrol. Estimates are that anywhere from 50 to 70% of a police department's sworn personnel comprise the patrol function, but in actuality it is often higher than that. In theory, patrol officers are the most valuable people in the police department. To a certain extent, all activity stems from the uniformed patrol officer. Ironically, this concept is not supported by such measures as salary, working conditions, and degree of authority. As a rule, the most burdensome and dangerous aspects of police work are performed by the uniformed patrol officer. Such work is often performed in an emotionally charged atmosphere of hostility, an environment that fosters distrust and anger. Those situations typically require patrol officers to wear many hats, quote unquote, such as clergy, psychologist, therapist, lawyer, and even street fighter. Patrol officers are expected to be all things to all people. Patrol officers will spend much of their day dealing with the dregs of society and in situations that often include the following: drunks who might have urinated on themselves but who must be searched before being transported to jail, prostitutes and their pimps, street thugs who are ready to fight, gang members who daily threaten officers, and murderers and sex offenders whose crimes might leave a lasting impression in the minds of the officers. The specific duties of patrol are peacekeeping, maintaining law and order, and detecting and arresting law violators. The word patrol stems from the French word patrouiller, meaning to tramp about in the mud, quote unquote. This definition implies that patrol work may be tiresome, difficult, and performed under the worst of circumstances. In many cases it is. Let's now examine some of the most typical varieties of patrol that are employed by modern-day police agencies. As the 20th century developed, the scope and function of police became more narrowly defined. In many departments, police became specialists in areas such as investigation, traffic, crime prevention, and patrol operations. In fact, the patrol function soon became a form of crime prevention in and of itself, whereby local and state enforcement agencies began analyzing crime patterns and occurrences and responding by assigning patrol officers to the highest crime areas. Thus, several innovative and effective types of patrol evolved: preventive patrol, saturation patrol, directed patrol, aggressive patrol, and foot patrol. Probably one of the most widely adopted types of patrol is preventive patrol, also known as routine or random patrol. Basically, it involves driving in a designated area or district on a random basis so that the patterns of the police cannot be predicted. This technique is regularly practiced by officers when they are in service, quote unquote, and not responding to radio calls. Depending on the size of the area to be patrolled, as well as other variables, the amount of time that officers can devote to preventive patrol varies. In addition, even the time of day can have an effect on the ability of the officer to patrol in this fashion, depending on how busy he or she is responding to calls. Research shows, however, that an estimated 50% of a patrol officer's time is available for patrol duties. In the past, patrols were organized by beats. It was assumed that crime can happen anywhere, so the entire beat must be patrolled at all times. Research shows, however, that a crime is not spread evenly over all times and places. Rather, direct contact predatory crimes, such as muggings and robberies, occur when three elements converge: motivated offenders, suitable targets, and the absence of anyone who could prevent the violation. This means that resources should be focused or directed on hotspots, which are places where crimes are likely to occur. Much of the difference between patrol types and methods lies in distinguishing between crime prevention and crime reaction. Many of the methods discussed here involve prevention techniques. This is related to the response role of police in terms of how quickly it takes officers to respond to a call for service. This ranges from routine incident response to emergency responses for abnormal occurrences. Foot patrol is the oldest method of patrol, predating the invention of the automobile. It entails officers walking through neighborhoods, which helps to enhance rapport between citizens and officers, but limits the officer's ability to give chase if the need arises. Saturation patrol involves concentrating officers in a certain area in an effort to catch criminals and to deter would-be offenders. Focus patrol focuses police efforts on certain problems, locations, or times. Although police respond to emergencies far less frequently than to routine incidents, emergency response is a vital aspect of what police agencies do. Emergency responses take priority over all other police work, and until order is restored, the officers involved will not turn to other tasks. An important part of police training involves emergency response techniques, including first aid, hostage rescue, and the physical capture of suspects. Perhaps the ultimate critical incident these days is the terrorist attack. An active shooter situation is equally critical. Most civilians are more familiar with the traffic enforcement function of police work than any other dimension of the job, often because they've been on the receiving end of the enforcement. Traffic enforcement is generally concerned with enforcement laws pertaining to motor vehicles and their operation. The text discusses the following areas of the traffic function: accident investigation, which involves stabilizing the scene, calling for assistance, triaging the injured, ensuring safety and traffic flow, and restoring the area to normal operations after the scene is cleared. It also discusses the pretextual stop, which is when an officer stops a vehicle for a legitimate reason but is also suspicious about the driver, and racial profiling, which has been defined as the use of discretionary authority by police officers, typically within the context of a traffic stop, that results in a disparate treatment of minorities. Finally, the text discusses pursuits of suspects who flee the police and the dangers created for anyone involved, including the public. Because the liability involved Most agencies have some sort of policy governing police pursuits, and many have adopted a, quote, violent felony, unquote, only policy. Numerous technologies have been developed to assist police with interrupting high-speed pursuits, including spike strips with remote control retraction for the pursuing patrol cars, and the auto arrestor, which is a device that disrupts the fleeing vehicle's electronics, kills their engine, and brings that vehicle safely to a stop. Peacekeeping and order maintenance are also critical police missions. Police officers take proactive steps to maintain peace and order by being present, for example, at sporting events and high-profile public protests. There is also a reactive element to peacekeeping and order maintenance, such as when neighborhood disorder and quality of life problems surface in the wake of civil disobedience and during crisis situations. Many police departments focus on quality of life offenses as a crime reduction and peacekeeping strategy. Quality of life offenses are minor law violations, sometimes called petty crimes, that demoralize residents and business people by creating disorder. Examples of petty crimes include excessive noise, graffiti, abandoned cars, and vandalism. Other quality of life offenses reflect social decay and include panhandling and aggressive begging, public urination, prostitution, roaming youth gangs, public consumption of alcohol, and street-level substance abuse. Homelessness, while not necessarily a violation of the law unless it involves some sort of trespass, is also typically addressed under quality of life programs. Through police interviews, the homeless may be relocated to shelters or hospitals or arrested for some other offense. Some researchers claim that reducing the number of quality of life offenses in a community can restore a sense of order, reduce the fear of crime, and lessen the number of serious crimes that occur. However, quality of life programs have been criticized by those who say the government should not be taking a law enforcement approach to social and economic problems. Police response to any of these order maintenance issues is the primary concern. For example, for civil disobedience situations, police must respect constitutional rights to free expression and may allow the gatherers to continue their protest as long as no major laws are being broken. Breaking up these situations could lead to further and unnecessary violence. Police are present to just ensure order and safety is maintained. I think you could see as an example the Ferguson, Missouri situation and what happened when the police were too proactive, for example. Criminal investigation is one of the most important police functions and certainly the most romanticized. Investigations in larger police agencies are handled by plainclothes detectives. Detective work would be unnecessary if patrol officers were able to catch all crimes in progress. Of course, they hardly ever do this, in part because they are spread so thin, hence the need for a dedicated criminal investigation division, especially in larger metropolitan areas. However, in the smallest agencies, patrol officers are the only ones available for follow-up investigations. At the heart of any investigation is the practice of criminalistics, which refers to the scientific study and evaluation of evidence associated with the commission of a crime. Criminalistics is about as old as policing itself. Henry Fielding's Bow Street Runners in the mid-1700s and Sir Robert Peel's Bobbies in the early 1800s experienced some early investigative success. The Bobbies, for instance, were occasionally removed from their patrol to perform investigations. Some fundamentals of detective work were developed over 100 years ago. Anthropometry, also known as Bertillon measurements, is a technique for identifying people based on their body measurements, and it was developed in 1882. Alphonse Bertillon, who developed this technique, concluded that if just 11 measurements were taken on a person, the odds of finding someone with similar measurements were 4,191,304 to 1. The problem, though, was in attempting to use these measurements to identify those who would most likely commit crimes. Bertillon successfully identified some criminals, but his ideas fell out of favor because they were inaccurate and a bit complicated. They were replaced with the more accurate identification practice of dactylography or fingerprinting. Trace evidence is minute-sized, nearly invisible evidence of a crime that would escape all but the most skilled investigators. Forensic evidence is any physical evidence whose usefulness in a court of law may not be immediately apparent to an untrained observer, but can be demonstrated through the application of accepted scientific techniques. Firearms identification, or ballistics, burst onto the criminalistic scene during the mid-1800s. In 1835, Henry Goddard, who was one of the last Bow Street runners, was the first to identify a murderer from a spent bullet removed from the victim's body. Firearms identification gained popularity in the early 1900s. Calvin Goddard is credited with making firearms identification a science through his development of the bullet comparison microscope. August Vollmer, the well-known Berkeley police chief during the early 20th century, that's the 1900s, is credited with helping initiate the police professionalism movement, but he also made his mark in early criminal investigations. He trained his officers in the identification and preservation of evidence and established a forensics lab in Los Angeles. The goals of criminal investigative work are much more complex than mystery novels and television shows depict. They include to determine whether a crime has been committed, to obtain information and evidence, to apprehend suspects, to recover stolen property, and successfully present the case to the prosecutor. Criminal investigations typically progress through two stages: the preliminary investigation and the follow-up investigation. The preliminary investigative steps include attend to emergencies, secure the scene, document the crime scene, search for evidence, collect evidence, question witnesses and suspects, and provide a written report to the prosecutor. Follow-up investigation steps include continuing the investigation through conducting interviews, canvassing neighborhoods and following leads, reconstructing the crime through inductive reasoning and the use of forensics experts and lab testing, and focusing the investigation on the suspect or suspects. Finally, this chapter concludes with a discussion of undercover work, which is closely aligned with investigations. Undercover work is common in the investigation and detection of vice crimes, particularly those involving the illicit drug trade. As the text points out, undercover officers enjoy a professional latitude in their roles, along with minimal department supervision. The work can be exciting, but it can also be dangerous. Problems associated with undercover work include long, unpredictable hours, temptations such as substance abuse, and strains on personal relationships. With regard to the successes, the thousands of drug busts has to be considered along with NBC's Dateline program, To Catch a Predator, which I'm sure most of you have seen, at least some of the sessions, and the group Perverted Justice with their accomplishments of catching sexual predators in undercover sting operations, as well as raising awareness to the problems of internet stalking. All right, to summarize this chapter, types of patrol include preventive, directed, and proactive patrol. Incident response includes both emergency response and routine incident response. Traffic enforcement consists of enforcing traffic laws, relieving congestion, and reducing accidents. Peacekeeping and order maintenance involve the management of disorder, quality of life policing, and the management of civil disobedience and crisis situations. Goals of police investigation include determining whether a crime has been committed, gathering info and evidence, and presenting the case to the prosecutor. Investigations usually have two stages: the preliminary investigation and the follow-up investigation. Finally, undercover work is especially challenging because it may tempt officers to break the law, and it can strain personal relationships. Before I close, be sure to read page 115 of the text that talks about high-tech innovation and how it meets law enforcement. Well, that's it for now. Be sure to thoroughly read this chapter in the text, and we'll see you in class.